The green pastures stretched endlessly before him, kissed by sunlight so radiant it seemed to sing. Trees, their branches towering as if to embrace the heavens, swayed gently in a breeze that carried whispers of life. A river cut through the land, its waters a silver ribbon that shimmered like molten light, stretching far beyond the horizon. Beneath the largest tree, its roots thick and gnarled as though cradling the earth itself, stood a figure. Though his back was turned, his presence radiated familiarity, solid, unshakable. Enki stepped forward, the grass soft under his bare feet, his heart pounding in rhythm with the distant hum of the water. "Father!" Enki called out, though his voice barely carried over the stillness. The man turned slowly, his face obscured by shadow. Yet there was something unmistakable in the tilt of his head, the broadness of his shoulders, and the way he stood as if bearing the weight of the world with ease. Before Enki could take another step, the scene began to unravel. The river stilled, its shimmer fading to dullness. The trees blurred, their heights shrinking. The light dimmed, and the warmth of the sun faded into a chill that clawed at his skin. "Father!" he shouted, louder this time, reaching out. But the figure vanished, leaving only the empty space beneath the tree. Enki gasped, his eyes snapping open to the pale grey of the morning. The air in his room was dry, the faint scent of cracked earth and herbs clinging to the walls. He sat up, clutching his knees as the remnants of the dream lingered in his mind. The words slipped from his lips in a whisper, like a secret carried by the wind. "Dad." The house was quiet except for the soft creak of the wooden beams that held it together. The air was dry, carrying the faint scent of herbs that hung from the rafters in tightly bound bundles. Enki moved carefully through the dimly lit space, his footsteps muted against the worn floorboards. In the corner of the room, Nala lay in her bed, her frail frame barely lifting the thin blanket that covered her. Her breathing was steady but shallow, and her skin, once sun-kissed and vibrant, was pale and paper-thin. A faint light from the window danced across her face, casting shadows on the deep lines of worry and exhaustion etched into her features. Enki approached quietly, carrying a small bowl of tea he had prepared with trembling hands. He set it on the bedside table, his heart tightening as he watched her stir. "Morning, mother," he said softly, kneeling beside her. Nala's eyes fluttered open, their warmth undiminished despite the weight of her illness. She offered him a weak but loving smile. "Morning, my boy. You're up early again." "I couldn't sleep," Enki admitted, brushing a strand of her silvered hair from her face. "I was thinking about things." Nala chuckled faintly, though it was more breath than sound. "You always think too much. Did you make the tea?" "Of course," Enki replied, lifting the bowl. He helped her sit up, his hand steadying her back as she took the first careful sip. "I used the herbs from the last bundle we had. It's not much, but it'll help." Her lips curved into a grateful smile as she drank. When she had finished, she leaned back against the pillow, her energy spent from even this small act. "You don't have to worry so much, Enki," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'll be fine." "You always say that," he replied, his voice breaking slightly, "but it doesn't make it true." For a moment there was silence between them, broken only by the sound of the wind outside brushing against the house. Nahla reached out, placing a frail hand over his. "You have your father's stubbornness, you know," she said with a faint smile. "Always thinking you can fix the unfixable." Enki's jaw tightened at the mention of his father. He wanted to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Instead he nodded, his gaze dropping to her hand, so small and fragile in his own. "I'll let you rest," he said quietly, standing. "I'll be back soon." As he turned to leave, Nahla called after him, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Enki, thank you for staying." He paused at the doorway, gripping the frame tightly. "Always," he said, his voice barely audible before he stepped outside. Enki stepped out of the house into the crisp morning air. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. The dry breeze carried the faint scent of dust and the bleating of sheep, a sound that brought a small measure of comfort to his otherwise heavy heart. He walked toward the pen where his flock milled about, their movements slow and languid in the heat of the early day. Asa, his favorite sheep, stood apart from the others, her head tilted curiously, as if she had been waiting for him. Her scarred muzzle, a reminder of the time he had nursed her back to health, caught the light, making her easy to pick out among the others. "There you are, Asa," Enki said softly, leaning against the wooden fence. The sheep bleated in response, her ears twitching. "What trouble have you been up to now?" He opened the gate and stepped inside the pen. Asa trotted up to him immediately, nuzzling his side with the familiarity of a companion rather than livestock. Enki crouched down, scratching her behind the ears as the other sheep ambled closer. "You're the only one who listens," he said with a faint smile, his fingers tracing the scar along her muzzle. "Everyone else is too busy worrying about the drought or clinging to old ways, but you've always been different, haven't you?" "Asa's not the only one you talk to, is she?" a teasing voice called out from behind him. Enki turned to see Cora standing just outside the pen, her arms crossed and a smirk playing on her lips. Her dark hair was tied back, but loose strands framed her face, catching the sunlight in a way that made her look as if she were glowing. "You're talking to sheep again, aren't you?" she said, stepping closer. "I swear, Enki, one day they're going to start talking back. And then what will we do with you?" Enki rolled his eyes but couldn't suppress the smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Better the sheep than the villagers. At least Asa doesn't lecture me about the drought every 5 minutes." Cora laughed, her voice bright and melodic, a rare sound in these hard times. "Fair point, but I'm starting to think Asa's the brains of this whole operation. Maybe she should be the one leading the Tau meeting." "Don't give her ideas," Enki said, scratching Asa's head again. "She already thinks she runs this place." "She probably does," Cora said with a grin. She leaned on the fence, watching him. "You've been quiet lately. Well, quieter than usual. Everything all right?" Enki hesitated, his hand stilling on Asa's head. "Just thinking." "Ah, dangerous territory," Cora said, though her tone softened. She stepped into the pen, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust as she approached him. "You've been carrying a lot on your shoulders lately. You don't have to handle it all alone, you know." "I don't know any other way," Enki admitted, standing and brushing off his hands. "It's not like anyone else is going to fix things." "Maybe not," Cora said, tilting her head to meet his gaze. "But you don't have to break yourself trying to save everyone either. The world's heavy enough without you carrying it all." Enki looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. For a moment, he felt the urge to tell her everything, the dream, the doubts gnawing at him. But he held back, offering her a faint smile instead. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. Cora sighed, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to press further. "Well, if Asa starts talking back, you'd better tell me first. I want to be there when it happens." Enki chuckled. "Deal." Asa bleated, as if to agree, and the two of them shared a quiet laugh. For a brief moment, the weight on Enki's shoulders felt just a little lighter. "There's a Tau meeting happening soon. Want to go to the market real quick?" Cora asked. "Sure. Maybe we will see someone to lighten the mood before the same old meeting about nothing happens again," Enki said, almost angry. The path to the market was dusty and uneven, the signs of drought etched into every crack in the ground and withering branch along the way. Enki and Cora walked in silence for a while, the tension of the morning still lingering between them. The sound of the market grew louder as they approached, a mix of muted chatter, the clinking of wares and the occasional thud of heavy baskets hitting the ground. When they entered the square, it was a stark reminder of how much had changed. What was once a bustling hub of life and trade now felt muted, its energy drained. Merchants sat idly behind stalls that offered little variety, firewood bundled with care, dried herbs strung together in neat rows, baskets woven with meticulous precision but no buyers in sight. The blacksmith's hammer fell rhythmically in the background, though even his work seemed subdued. Cora nudged Enki with her elbow. "Not much of a crowd today," she said, her tone light but tinged with sadness. "It's not the crowd I'm worried about," Enki replied, scanning the faces of the villagers. Their expressions mirrored the market. Tired, resigned, waiting for a miracle that might never come. They stopped at a stall where Barid, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a weathered face, was arranging bundles of firewood. He looked up as they approached, his expression softening when he recognized them. "Enki," Barid said with a nod. "And Cora. It's good to see young faces around here. Bring some life to this place." Cora smiled faintly. "We try. How's business, Barid?" Barid snorted, shaking his head. "Business? No one has time for firewood when there's barely enough food to cook. But we keep trying, don't we?" His gaze shifted to Enki. "How's your mother?" Enki stiffened, the question hitting harder than he expected. "She's resting," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "She's missed," Barid said, his tone softer now. "This market isn't the same without her. She always had something kind to say, always made us feel like things would be okay." "She had a way of doing that," another voice chimed in. Lena, a woman known for her skill in weaving, stepped forward from her stall. Her hands were busy tying a bundle of baskets, but her eyes held a deep sadness. "Even when times were hard, Nala made you believe they'd get better." Enki's throat tightened. He wanted to defend her, to say she was still that person, but the truth weighed heavily on him. "She'll be back," he said, more to himself than to them. Before anyone could respond, the toll of the town bell rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the quiet hum of the market. Everyone froze, their eyes turning toward the sound. "The town meeting," Barid muttered, his brow furrowing. "It's starting." A wave of murmurs rippled through the square as merchants and villagers alike began to pack up their goods and head toward the meeting hall. Cora touched Enki's arm, her expression concerned. "You okay?" Enki nodded, though his mind was already racing. "Yeah, let's go." Together they followed the crowd, the weight of the bell's toll pressing down on them as they walked toward what was sure to be a tense and pivotal gathering. The villagers gathered in the clearing as the last toll of the bell echoed through the still air. The wide circle of benches surrounding the raised platform creaked under the weight of the crowd, their unease palpable. Whispers rippled through the group as they speculated about what the elders might say. Amar stood on the platform, his tall frame commanding attention. His staff, a symbol of his authority, was firmly planted by his side. The setting sun cast long shadows across his weathered face, making the lines of age and experience even more pronounced. "People of our village," Amar began, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "we gather today under the weight of a heavy truth. The drought that has plagued us for a year is but the beginning. The prophecy is being fulfilled. 7 seasons of drought lie ahead of us." A collective gasp swept through the crowd, followed by an eruption of voices. "7 seasons!" someone cried. "How will we survive that?" Another shouted. Amar raised a hand, demanding silence. "We must endure. We have done so before, and we will do so again. This village has faced hardship, and together we will rise above it." Lena, a skilled weaver sitting near the front, stood. "Endurance is not enough, Amar," she said, her voice trembling. "Our fields are barren. Our livestock are dying. How can we endure 7 seasons without hope?" The crowd buzzed with agreement, their voices a mix of fear and frustration. Amar's grip on his staff tightened, but before he could respond, Enki rose from his seat near the edge of the gathering. "What if there's another way?" Enki said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. The crowd turned to look at him, their eyes filled with curiosity and doubt. Even Ammar's sharp gaze landed on him, his brow furrowing. "What are you saying, Enki?" Ammar asked, his tone heavy with skepticism. Enki stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "I'm saying we don't have to accept this as our fate. We don't have to just survive. We can thrive. We can find a way to grow, even in barren ground." A ripple of murmurs spread through the villagers. Barid, sitting beside Lena, stood as well. "Thrive? On what, boy? There's nothing left to grow, no water to sustain us. You speak as though you've seen something we haven't." "I have," Enki replied, his voice rising. "I've seen it in my dreams, green pastures, trees that touch the sky, waters that stretch beyond the horizon. I believe there's more than what we see now." "Dreams?" Ammar scoffed, his voice cutting through the rising chatter. "Dreams won't fill our bellies or water our crops. Dreams won't save this village." Enki's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. "Maybe not. But what if they could show us the way? What if we've been looking at this drought all wrong? What if there's a way to bring life back to this land?" "You speak as your father once did," Ammar said sharply, his voice low but full of tension. "And look where that led him, to leaving this village behind, chasing a vision that brought us nothing but loss." Enki flinched at the mention of his father, but he didn't back down. Maybe he was right. Maybe he saw something worth chasing, something bigger than himself. "And you think you'll find it?" Ammar demanded. "You who have barely seen the world beyond these hills?" "Yes," Enki said firmly, "because I believe there's more out there, and I believe I can bring it back." The crowd fell into uneasy silence, their gazes shifting between Enki and Ammar. Lena spoke again, her voice softer this time. "If there's even a chance he's right, shouldn't we let him try?" Barid nodded reluctantly. "He's young, but maybe that's what we need. Someone who hasn't given up yet." Ammar's eyes swept over the villagers, their expressions a mixture of doubt and cautious hope. Finally he turned back to Enki, his face hard but resigned. "If you leave, you leave alone," Ammar said. "This village will not follow a dreamer into the unknown, but if you believe in this so strongly, go. Prove us wrong." "I will," Enki said, his voice steady. "And when I return, I'll bring something that will change this village forever." Ammar said nothing, turning his gaze away. The bell tolled again, signaling the end of the meeting. The villagers began to disperse, their whispers filling the quiet as they returned to their homes. Cora approached Enki, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. "That was bold," she said. "I had to say it," Enki replied, his gaze distant. "I can't stay here and do nothing." Cora hesitated, then touched his arm lightly. "Then go. But don't forget to come back." Enki nodded, his resolve hardening as the crowd thinned around him. He looked toward the horizon, the path ahead already forming in his mind. The crowd from the Tau meeting dispersed slowly, their voices fading into the stillness of the evening. Enki lingered at the edge of the village, his thoughts a tangled web of frustration and determination. The stars began to emerge one by one, faint glimmers against the deepening purple sky. He kicked at the dry dirt beneath his feet, his mind replaying the sharpness of Ammar's words. "You go alone. This village will endure, with or without your dreams." Enki sighed and began walking aimlessly, the worn leather of his sandals scuffing against the ground. The cool night air wrapped around him, a stark contrast to the heat of the day. His path led him toward the outskirts of the village, where the hills rolled into the barren horizon. "Seems you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders," a voice said, smooth and deep, cutting through the silence. Enki froze, his eyes darting around in the dim light. Near a cluster of rocks a figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall and lean, his dark robes blending seamlessly with the night. His face was partially hidden by the hood he wore, but the faint light of the stars caught the glint of a knowing smile. "Who's there?" Enki asked, his hand instinctively moving to the small knife tucked into his belt. The man stepped forward, his movements unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. "No need for that," he said, nodding toward the knife. "I'm no threat to you, boy. Just a wanderer passing through." Enki narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" "Zambu," the man replied, pulling back his hood to reveal sharp, weathered features. His dark eyes seemed to peer straight through Enki, as though he could see everything hidden beneath the surface. "And you are, let me guess, a dreamer." Enki stiffened. "How do you know that?" Zambu chuckled, his voice low and rich. "It's written all over you. That faraway look, the weight you carry. You're trying to hold something bigger than yourself, aren't you?" "I'm trying to help my village," Enki said, his voice defensive. "But no one understands. They think I'm chasing foolish dreams." "And are you?" Zambu asked, his tone light but his gaze unwavering. Enki hesitated, then shook his head. "Number, I know there's more out there. I've seen it in my dreams. Green pastures, water as far as the eye can see. A life of abundance." Zambu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Dreams can be powerful things if you know how to listen to them. Tell me, boy, what makes you so sure this abundance you speak of is real?" Enki hesitated. I don't know. I just feel it. Deep down, I know it's out there." Zambu studied him for a long moment, then reached into the folds of his robe and pulled out a small pouch. From it, he drew a coin, worn and tarnished but unmistakably unique. He held it out for Enki to see. "This belonged to a man I once knew," Zambu said, his voice softer now. "A man who spoke of abundance the same way you do. He believed in it so deeply, it became his life's work." Enki's breath caught as he recognized the coin. "That's my father's." Zambu arched a brow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "So you are Taran's son. I thought I saw the resemblance." "You knew him?" Enki asked, his voice trembling. "You knew my father?" "I did," Zambu said, handing the coin to Enki. "He was a man of great vision, much like you, but visions can be dangerous things if you're not prepared to follow them." Enki turned the coin over in his hands, his mind racing. "What happened to him?" Zambu's expression grew somber. "He left this village in search of the abundance he believed in. He found it in a place where people thrived despite the hardships of the world, but the journey took its toll on him." "Did he die there?" Enki asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zambu nodded. "He gave everything he had to help others. His legacy lives on in the lives he touched, and now it seems in you." Enki stared at the coin, its weight suddenly feeling much heavier in his hand. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you remind me of him," Zambu said simply. "And because I believe in what you're trying to do. But belief alone won't be enough, boy. You need to understand what abundance truly means." Enki frowned. "What does it mean?" Zambu's smile returned, though it was tinged with a hint of mystery. "Abundance isn't about what you have. It's about what you see, what you give, and what you grow. It starts here," he said, tapping his temple. "And here," he added, placing a hand over his chest. "If you can master that, the rest will follow." The two stood in silence for a moment, the words settling over Enki like the cool night air. Finally, Zambu stepped back, his figure merging with the shadows once more. "Your journey is just beginning, Enki," he said. "Listen to your dreams. They'll guide you." Before Enki could respond, Zambu was gone, leaving him alone beneath the starlit sky, but in his hand he held the coin, a tangible piece of his father's legacy, and a reminder that the path ahead, though uncertain, was one he was meant to walk. The village was quiet as Enki walked back from his encounter with Zambu. The stars shimmered faintly in the cool night sky, casting a gentle glow over the cracked earth and modest homes of his people. Zambu's words echoed in his mind, the coin in his pocket feeling heavier with every step. Abundance isn't about what you have. It's about what you see, what you give, and what you grow. As Enki approached his home, he paused to look at the small, weathered structure where his mother and grandfather resided. The faint light of a flickering lamp glowed through the window, casting long shadows on the walls. He inhaled deeply, steeling himself for what was to come. Before entering his home, Enki detoured to the sheep pen where the flock rested. Asa, his favorite sheep, stood slightly apart from the others, her scarred face turned toward him as though she sensed his approach. He knelt beside her, running his fingers through her thick wool. "I'm leaving, Asa," he said softly, his voice catching in his throat. "I don't know how long I'll be gone, but I have to do this, for the village, for Mother, for all of us." Asa nudged his hand with her nose, her warm breath comforting in the chill of the night. Enki leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "You've always been my guide," he whispered. "Even when no one else understood, you did. Take care of the flock while I'm gone." Asa gave a soft bleat, as if in response. Enki lingered for a moment longer before rising. "Goodbye, old friend," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Inside the house, Nala lay in her bed, her frail form illuminated by the dim light of the lamp. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her eyes closed as she rested. Enki sat beside her, taking her hand gently in his. "Mother," he said softly, his voice breaking the stillness. Her eyes fluttered open, and she turned her head toward him. A faint smile touched her lips. "Enki," she murmured, "you're still awake." "I wanted to talk to you," he said, brushing a strand of her hair from her face. "I'm leaving in the morning." Nala's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. "You're going to chase the dream, aren't you?" "I have to," Enki said, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "The village is falling apart, and I can't just stand by and watch. I need to find a way to bring life back to this place." Nala's hand tightened weakly around his. "Your father had dreams like that," she said, her voice distant. "He always believed in something greater, something beyond what we could see." "And I believe it too," Enki said. "I believe I can find it, Mother. I'll find a way to heal this village, and to heal you." A tear slipped down Nala's cheek, but she smiled faintly. "You've always been so much like him," she whispered. "Go, my son, follow the dream. But promise me one thing." "Anything," Enki said, his voice trembling. "Promise me you'll come back," Nala said. "No matter what you find out there, come back to us." "I promise," Enki said, his throat tight with emotion. He kissed her forehead gently, lingering for a moment before rising to leave the room. Enki found Amar sitting by the window, his gaze fixed on the village below. The elder's face was etched with worry and fatigue, his hands gripping his staff tightly. The soft light of the moon streamed through the window, casting shadows that made him look even older than his years. "You're really going through with this?" Amar said without turning around. "I am," Enki replied, his voice steady. "I have to." Amar let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head. "This village has endured for generations. We've survived droughts, famine, loss, all without chasing dreams." "And how much longer can we survive like this?" Enki asked. "You've taught me to care for this village, to protect our people. That's why I'm leaving, to find a way to save it." Amar finally turned to face him, his expression a mix of anger and sorrow. "You think you can save us by abandoning us? By chasing the same foolish dream that took your father away?" "I'm not abandoning anyone," Enki said firmly. I'm fighting for this village, just like you taught me. And when I come back, I'll bring hope with me." Ammar stared at him for a long moment before letting out a weary sigh. He tapped his staff on the ground, gesturing for Enki to sit beside him. Reluctantly, Enki complied, settling into the quiet tension that filled the room. "Do you remember the story of the stones at the bottom of the river?" Ammar asked, his voice quieter now. Enki tilted his head, caught off guard. "Of course," he said. "You told it to me 100 times. "Then tell me what you remember," Ammar said, his sharp gaze locking onto Enki. Enki hesitated before speaking. "You said the river flows because the stones at its bottom hold firm. The stones don't complain or crumble. They endure. Without them, the river would have no direction, no purpose." Ammar nodded slowly. "And do you know why I told you that story, boy?" "To teach me about resilience," Enki said. "To remind me to stand strong, no matter what comes." "Yes," Ammar said, his voice thick with emotion, "but also to teach you the importance of staying where you're needed. The stones don't move, they don't chase the river, they anchor it." Enki's heart ached at his grandfather's words, but he took a steadying breath and replied, "You were right about the stones, grandfather. But you forgot one thing." "And what's that?" Ammar asked, narrowing his eyes. "The stones don't need to chase the river," Enki said, "but the river doesn't flow without them. The river and the stones, they work together. They need each other." Ammar fell silent, his jaw tightening. Enki pressed on. "I'm not abandoning the village," Enki said. "I'm carving a new path for it, a path that leads to life and hope. I'm doing what the stones can't, moving with the river so it can flow stronger." The room fell silent, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Ammar reached out, placing a hand on Enki's shoulder. "You're stubborn," he said gruffly, "just like your father." "And just like you," Enki said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Ammar huffed, but there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Go then. But remember, this village will endure, with or without you." "It will endure," Enki said, "but I'll make sure it thrives." Ammar stepped back, his gaze softening. "Take care of yourself, boy." "I will," Enki said. As Enki rose to leave, Ammar's voice stopped him. "Enki." "Yes, grandfather." "For what it's worth," Ammar said quietly, "maybe you're right about the river." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Just don't forget where your home is." Enki nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. With a deep breath, he turned and stepped out into the cool night air, the weight of his decision settling over him. The first steps away from the village felt heavier than Enki had imagined. The air was still, the quiet hum of the world around him, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind through the brittle grass. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The sight of the village he had known his entire life might anchor his feet to the ground, undoing his resolve to leave. The road stretched ahead of him, a dusty path bordered by dry, cracked earth. The drought's grip on the land was unmistakable. Each step stirred a small puff of dust, the sound of his sandals against the ground, a lonely rhythm. He carried little with him. A bag slung over his shoulder, a water skin, and a small bundle of food Nala had insisted on preparing, though her frailty had made even that task a labor of love. As the hours passed, the vastness of the open land began to weigh on him. The sun hung high in the sky, its relentless heat pressing down. Beads of sweat formed on his brow, and his water skin grew lighter with each sip. The distant mountains, barely visible on the horizon, seemed no closer than when he had started. The solitude gave way to his thoughts, which churned like restless waves. He replayed his last moments in the village, the quiet farewell with his mother, the hesitant pride in Ammar's eyes, Korra's parting words. Their faces lingered in his mind, filling him with equal parts determination and doubt. The sun had long since begun its descent, painting the horizon with streaks of amber and violet. Enki's legs ached from the miles he had walked, the dry air scraping against his throat with each breath. His water skin was empty now, and his pace had slowed to a trudge as the vast barren land stretched endlessly before him. Then faintly, almost too faint to notice, he heard it, a melody. At first it was so soft he thought it might be the wind weaving through the sparse trees, but as he stilled his steps and strained to listen, the sound grew clearer. It was familiar, achingly so, a song. Not just any song, but the tune his mother used to hum when he was a boy. It carried on the breeze, delicate and soothing, wrapping around him like a long-forgotten embrace. Enki froze, his heart quickening. "Mother," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. But there was no answer, only the melody beckoning him forward. Driven by equal parts desperation and curiosity, he followed the sound. His surroundings blurred as he focused on the song, his feet moving instinctively, drawn toward its source. The melody grew louder, more vivid, until it seemed to fill the air around him. As he crested a small rise, he saw it, a tiny stream nestled in a grove of trees, its crystal-clear waters reflecting the soft glow of the fading sun. And there, standing at the water's edge, was the fox. The creature's fiery coat seemed to shimmer in the twilight, its bright eyes watching him intently. Enki stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The song faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind an almost sacred silence. The fox didn't move, its gaze steady and unblinking, as if waiting for him. Enki felt a chill despite the warmth of the evening air. There was something otherworldly about the creature, something that seemed to connect it to the melody he had just heard. He stepped closer, his movements cautious, as though afraid to break the fragile moment. The fox remained still, its tail flicking once in acknowledgement, and then it tilted its head toward the stream as if to say, "Drink." Enki hesitated, still shaken by the song and the sight of the fox. Slowly he knelt by the stream, cupping the cool water in his hands and bringing it to his parched lips. The relief was immediate, a soothing balm against the dryness that had taken hold of him. He drank deeply, filling his water skin, all the while feeling the fox's eyes on him. "Were you guiding me?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with wonder. He wasn't expecting an answer, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the fox had been leading him here, that it had something to do with his mother's song. The fox remained silent, its presence calm but commanding. Enki stared back at it, and for a fleeting moment he felt as though he were looking into the eyes of an ancient friend. The fox blinked once, slowly, then turned and began to walk away, its tail brushing the grass as it disappeared into the shadows of the trees. "Wait!" Enki called, rising to his feet. But the fox was gone, leaving only the faint ripple of the stream and the soft rustle of leaves in its wake. Enki stood there for a long moment, the fading light casting long shadows around him. The song still echoed faintly in his mind, a reminder of his mother and the inexplicable bond that seemed to connect her to this moment. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a renewed strength, a sense that he wasn't as alone as he thought. He slung his water skin over his shoulder and stepped back onto the path, glancing one last time at the stream. The fox was gone, but its presence lingered, as if the land itself had whispered its guidance to him. With a deep breath, Enki continued his journey. The memory of the song and the fox etched into his thoughts, both a comfort and a mystery. Somewhere beyond the horizon, his answers waited, and now he was certain he would find them. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon as Enki trudged forward, his steps weary but resolute. The encounter at the stream still lingered in his mind. The fox and his mother's song, a quiet mystery that seemed to echo in every footfall. The land around him was dry and desolate, but as he crested a small hill, his eyes fell upon a modest farm nestled in the valley below. The fields were barren, their once fertile soil cracked and grey. A lone figure stood in the center, hunched over and struggling with something at his feet. Enki squinted, taking in the sight of the man's tattered clothes and the defeated slump of his shoulders. It was clear this farmer was battling against a land that had given up. Enki approached cautiously, his sandals kicking up dust as he descended the hill. As he drew closer, the farmer straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with a frayed sleeve. He turned to face Enki, his expression a mix of wariness and exhaustion. "Who are you?" the farmer asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. He gripped a rusted hoe tightly, as though prepared to defend himself. Enki raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "My name is Enki," he said, his tone calm and steady. "I'm a traveler. I mean no harm." The farmer's grip on the hoe loosened slightly, though suspicion lingered in his eyes. "What brings you here, traveler? There's not much left in these parts but dust and despair." Enki glanced around, taking in the empty fields and the crumbling walls of the farmhouse in the distance. "I saw your farm from the hill," he said. "It looked troubled." The farmer let out a bitter laugh. "Troubled? That's one way to put it. This land hasn't yielded a single crop since the drought began. I've done everything I can think of, but the earth refuses to listen." Enki stepped closer, his gaze softening. "Sometimes the earth needs more than effort," he said. "It needs hope." The farmer shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. "Hope doesn't put food on the table." "No," Enki agreed, "but it's where everything starts." The farmer studied him for a long moment, then let out a heavy sigh. "If you're here to preach about hope, you've come to the wrong place." "I'm not here to preach," Enki said gently. "I'm here to help." The farmer arched an eyebrow, skepticism etched into every line of his weathered face. "Help? And what exactly can you do that I haven't already tried?" Enki smiled faintly. "Maybe I can show you." The farmer hesitated, then nodded toward the farmhouse. "If you're so eager to help, you can start by staying the night. There's an empty cot in the barn. But I warn you, you won't find much here but hard work and disappointment." "I'll take my chances," Enki said, his smile widening. That evening, the farmhouse was quiet as the sun dipped below the horizon, its fading light casting long shadows over the barren fields. The farmer, whose name Enki learned was Kiran, lit a small lantern and placed it on the rickety table in the kitchen. The room was sparse, its corners filled with the scent of dry wood and faint desperation. They sat together over a simple meal, hard bread, dried beans, and a small piece of salted meat Kiran had rationed. It wasn't much, but Enki accepted it gratefully. "Why are you really here?" Kiran asked after a long silence, his voice low. "No one comes this far out unless they're running from something or searching for something." Enki paused, considering his words. "Maybe it's a bit of both," he admitted. "I'm searching for something I can't quite name yet. But I'm also trying to leave behind a way of thinking that keeps people tied to their struggles." Kiran scoffed. "That sounds like something someone who's never had to fight for every scrap of food would say." "I've had my share of struggles," Enki said, his tone steady, "but I've also learned that the way we think about those struggles can change how we face them." "And what would you have me do?" Kiran asked, leaning back in his chair. "Think happy thoughts and hope the fields start growing again?" "No," Enki said simply. "But I can show you how to work with the land in a way that listens to what it needs, like capturing the dew in the morning or planting seeds that can thrive where others fail." Kiran frowned. "Seeds that thrive in barren ground?" Enki nodded. "They exist, and I can help you find them." Kiran was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the lantern's flickering flame. Finally, he sighed. "You're an odd one, Enki, but I've got nothing left to lose." Enki smiled. "Then let's start tomorrow." The morning sun rose, casting a pale golden light over the barren fields as Enki and Kiran set off toward the market. The walk was quiet at first, save for the crunch of dry earth beneath their feet and the faint rustle of a passing breeze. Kieran carried an empty burlap sack slung over his shoulder, its weightless presence a stark reminder of the scarcity they faced. "Are you sure about this?" Kieran asked, breaking the silence. His tone was cautious, skeptical. "I haven't been to the market in weeks. It's been hard." "I'm sure," Enki replied with calm certainty. "Sometimes the answers we're looking for aren't where we expect them to be." Kieran didn't respond, but his steps quickened slightly as though Enki's quiet confidence was nudging him forward. The market was a modest collection of stalls and carts arranged in a rough semicircle, each vendor peddling what little they could. The atmosphere was subdued, a far cry from the bustling energy Enki remembered from his village's market before the drought. Here, the air was thick with murmured conversations and the occasional frustrated sigh. Kieran's eyes darted nervously between the stalls. "I don't have much to trade," he muttered, gripping the edge of his sack. "It's not always about what you have," Enki said. Sometimes it's about what you can offer." Kieran frowned but said nothing, his gaze landing on a small stall tucked at the edge of the market. Behind it stood a broad-shouldered man with a thick salt and pepper beard. His cart was lined with jars of honey, dried fruits, and a small basket of peculiar seeds. "That's Samir," Kieran said. "He's persistent." Enki raised an eyebrow. "Persistent? Always trying to sell something, even when people don't want it," Kieran explained. "He's been here for years, but lately his stall's been struggling." Enki nodded thoughtfully. "Let's talk to him." Samir looked up as they approached, his expression guarded but curious. "Kieran," he greeted with a nod. "Been a while since I've seen you around here." "It has," Kieran admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "I've been preoccupied." Samir glanced at Enki. "And who's this?" "A traveler," Kieran said. "His name's Enki." Samir extended a hand and Enki shook it firmly. "A pleasure," Samir said. "What brings you to our humble market?" Enki gestured to the basket of seeds. "Those caught my eye. What are they?" Samir's face brightened slightly. "Ah, these are something special. Seeds that thrive in barren ground. Perfect for this drought, if anyone around here had the faith to try them." Kieran's brow furrowed. "Why haven't you planted them yourself?" Samir let out a dry chuckle. "I'm a merchant, not a farmer. My skills are in trade, not soil." Enki picked up one of the seeds, rolling it between his fingers. "Sometimes what seems small can grow into something transformative," he said thoughtfully. Samir tilted his head, intrigued. "You've got an interesting way of looking at things." Enki smiled. "It's not just about the seeds. It's about how we think about the land and what we give back to it." Samir rubbed his beard, considering. "Not many people around here think like that. Most are just trying to survive." "And survival is important," Enki said. "But so is believing in the possibility of more, even in times like these." Kieran, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "What would you trade for the seeds, Samir?" Samir waved a hand dismissively. "Take them. If they grow, we'll talk about trade later." Kieran's eyes widened in surprise. "You're giving them away?" Samir shrugged. "What good are they sitting here? Maybe they'll do someone else some good." Enki nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Samir. I think these will be more valuable than you know." As they turned to leave, Enki paused, glancing back at Samir. "You've got honey and dried fruits," he said, "but have you thought about trading water or grain?" Samir frowned. "Water? Grain? That's not what I usually deal in." "It's what people need most right now," Enki said simply. "Sometimes adapting to what others need is the best way to thrive." Samir scratched his chin thoughtfully. "I'll think about it." Enki smiled. "Good. I have a feeling your stall will be bustling in no time." As Kieran and Enki turned to leave, Samir's sharp eyes caught a glint of something as Enki adjusted his pouch. A single coin fell to the ground, rolling in a lazy spiral before settling near Samir's feet. He bent down to pick it up, holding it between his fingers with a curious expression. "Where did you get this?" Samir asked, his voice tinged with surprise. Enki turned back, puzzled by the intensity in Samir's tone. "It belonged to my father," he said. "Why?" Samir held the coin up to the light, examining its intricate design. The edges were worn, but the markings were unmistakable. "I've seen this coin before," he said slowly. "It's from a place far from here, a place some call the Sunlands." Enki's breath caught. "The Sunlands?" Samir nodded, his gaze still fixed on the coin. "Not many people have coins like this. They say it comes from a land where the droughts never touch the soil, where water flows freely and abundance is a way of life. I've only heard stories, but this coin proves it exists." Kieran stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "You've really heard of this place?" Samir looked at him, his expression serious. "I have. Travelers passing through the market have spoken of it in hushed tones. They say the Sunlands are hidden, protected by people who guard their secrets fiercely. Some think it's just a legend, but seeing this—" He handed the coin back to Enki with a faint smile. "Maybe it's more than a story." Enki stared at the coin in his palm, his mind racing. The Sunlands. Could this be the place his father had sought so long ago? Was it the place he himself was destined to find? "Thank you, Samir," Enki said, slipping the coin back into his pouch. "You've given me more than you know." Samir chuckled softly. "You've got a long journey ahead of you, my friend, but if anyone can find it, I think it's you." As they left the market, the seeds safely tucked away and the coin weighing heavily in his pocket, Kieran glanced at Enki. "Do you think the Sunlands are real?" he asked. "I don't just think," Enki said, his voice steady. "I know." Kieran frowned. "How can you be so sure?" Enki's gaze lifted to the horizon. "Because my father believed in it, and because every step I take brings me closer to understanding what he was searching for." Kieran fell silent, the weight of Enki's conviction settling between them. The journey back to the farm felt different now, as though the air itself had shifted. Kieran carried the seeds, but Enki carried something greater. The hope of finding the Sunlands and uncovering the truth of his father's legacy. The sun was low in the sky by the time Enki and Kieran returned to the farm. The barren fields bathed in a soft amber glow. Kieran set the sack of seeds down on the weathered kitchen table, his expression a mixture of hope and hesitation. The modest house was quiet, save for the faint creaking of wood and the distant call of a bird seeking shelter for the night. Kieran slumped into a chair, rubbing his temples. "These seeds better be worth it," he muttered. "I've tried everything else." Enki smiled faintly, retrieving a small bundle of materials from his own pack. "It's not just about the seeds," he said. "It's also about how we work with the land." Kieran raised an eyebrow. "The land's been working against me for years. What else is there to try?" Enki moved to the door, gesturing for Kieran to follow him. "Come on, let me show you something." Out in the fields the air had cooled, and the stars began to emerge one by one. Enki knelt near the edge of the field, selecting a low spot where the ground dipped slightly. From his bundle, he unfolded a thin cloth and several smooth stones. Kieran watched from a few paces away, arms crossed skeptically. "What are you doing?" Kieran asked. Enki smiled, setting the cloth over the low spot and anchoring it with the stones. "Capturing dew," he said simply. Kieran blinked. "Dew?" Enki nodded. "Even in a drought, the morning brings moisture. It's not much, but it's something. With traps like this, you can collect enough water to keep your seeds alive in their most fragile state." Kieran crouched beside him, inspecting the setup. "And you think this will work?" "I know it will," Enki said. "The land gives in small ways, even when it seems like it has nothing left. It's up to us to notice and use what it offers." Kieran was silent for a moment, then sighed. "It's simple, too simple, but I'll try anything at this point." The next morning,
As the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, Kieran and Enki returned to the field. The cloth was damp with tiny beads of water, which Enki carefully transferred into a small vessel. Kieran's eyes widened as he watched, his skepticism softening. "You were right," Kieran admitted. "I didn't think it was possible." "Abundance often starts small," Enki said, handing him the vessel. "Now let's give these seeds a chance." Kieran took the seeds from the sack and knelt beside Enki, together pressing them into the dry soil. As they worked, Enki spoke softly, explaining the philosophy he had learned. "These seeds aren't just for survival," he said. "They're a promise that even in the hardest times life can find a way." Kieran looked up at him, his expression thoughtful. "You talk like someone who's seen these promises kept." Enki smiled faintly, thinking of the Sunlands. "I have." That evening, as they sat together over a meager meal, Kieran seemed lighter, the weight of despair lifting from his shoulders. The seeds were planted, the dewtrap set, and for the first time in months, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "If this works," Kieran said quietly, "you'll have done more for me than I can ever repay." Enki shook his head. "It's not about repayment. It's about believing in what's possible. Once the seeds grow, you'll have a chance to share that belief with others." Kieran nodded slowly, his gaze distant as he considered the fields outside. "Maybe this drought isn't the end," he murmured. "Maybe it's just a beginning." "It always is," Enki said softly, a knowing smile on his lips. The dawn broke gently over Kieran's farm, painting the barren fields in shades of soft gold. Enki stood outside the small farmhouse, watching as the first rays of sunlight kissed the dewtraps scattered across the land. Beads of water sparkled like tiny jewels, a testament to the quiet work they had done together. Kieran emerged from the house, his steps slow and contemplative. He carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, which he held out to Enki. "For the road," Kieran said. "It's not much, just some dried fruit and what little grain I could spare. You'll need it more than I will." Enki accepted the bundle with a grateful nod. "Thank you, Kieran, but you have more than you think. These fields, these seeds, they'll carry you further than you realize." Kieran glanced toward the newly planted rows of soil, the faintest hint of green beginning to peek through the dry earth. "I still can't believe it's working," he said, almost to himself. "I never thought I'd see growth here again." Enki smiled. "Belief is the first step, the rest is patience and care." Kieran studied him for a moment, his expression a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "You've changed something here, Enki. Not just the land, but me. I've spent so long thinking about what I don't have. You reminded me to see what I do." Enki placed a hand on Kieran's shoulder. "Abundance isn't just about what grows in the soil. It's about what grows in us. You've already begun." The sun hung mercilessly overhead, its heat pressing down like an unrelenting weight. Enki's lips were cracked, his throat dry and raw. His water skin, now empty, swung limply at his side, a cruel reminder of his dwindling strength. The barren landscape stretched endlessly before him, the horizon shimmering with the cruel mirage of water that was never there. His steps faltered, the world blurred at the edges, colors fading into one another as his mind drifted. His knees buckled, and for a moment he knelt in the dirt, his head bowed. Then a sound, a faint melody, carried on the wind. It was familiar, achingly so. It was a tune his mother used to hum, soft and soothing, a balm against the harshness of life. "Am I dreaming?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. The world around him shifted. The barren land melted away, replaced by a vision of green pastures. Trees, tall and majestic, reached toward the sky, their branches dancing in a gentle breeze. A river meandered through the landscape, its waters sparkling like liquid light. And there she was. My mother, young and vibrant, stood before him. Her frail body, so confined by illness in reality, was now full of life. Her laughter rang out, a sound he hadn't heard in years, as she held out her hand to him. "Come," she said, her voice melodic and tender. "Dance with me." Enki's heart ached as he rose, his limbs feeling weightless in this dream-like state. He took her hand, and they began to move. The ground beneath them seemed to hum with energy as they danced, a rhythm that connected him to the earth, to the sky, and to something greater. "You are stronger than you think," Nala said, her words lilting like a song. "You are the sun's warmth, the river's flow, the wind that carries seeds to barren ground. You are resilience. You are hope." Enki's eyes brimmed with tears as he held her words close. "I don't know if I can do this," he confessed, his voice breaking. "It's too much." Nala smiled, her eyes glowing with a mother's infinite love. "Strength is not the absence of doubt, my son. It is the choice to press on despite it." As quickly as it had appeared, the vision began to fade. The pastures dimmed, the trees dissolved, and Nala's touch slipped from his grasp. "No!" Enki cried out, reaching for her as she vanished into the ether. Reality crashed back in. The arid land surrounded him once more, the oppressive heat bearing down. His body trembled as he collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face. The flash of russet fur caught Enki's eye again, darting across the horizon. It was the fox, unmistakable in its sharp elegance, his water skin dangling from its mouth. The sight ignited a spark of desperation in him, a last ember of strength he didn't know he had. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice cracking as he stumbled to his feet. The fox paused for a heartbeat, its amber eyes locking onto his. There was an intelligence in its gaze, a challenge, as if daring him to follow. Then it turned and sprinted off, its movements fluid and swift. "No!" Enki gasped, breaking into an unsteady run. His legs were like lead, each step a struggle, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. The fox darted ahead, weaving through jagged rocks and patches of dry grass, always staying just out of reach. "Come back!" Enki yelled, his breaths ragged, the arid landscape blurred around him as he focused solely on the creature. The sun bore down mercilessly, his body screaming for rest, but he pushed forward. His desperation grew with each step, his mind consumed by the thought of the water, of survival, of the fox's maddeningly calm pace. Enki stumbled over a root, his body hitting the hard earth with a thud. Pain shot through him, but he forced himself up, his vision swimming. The fox was still ahead, its tail flicking like a silent taunt before it disappeared over the crest of a hill. Climbing the slope was agony, his muscles trembling with the effort. "Just wait," he muttered, his voice breaking into a whisper. As he reached the top, the sight below stopped him in his tracks. The fox stood at the edge of a shimmering pool of water, a hidden oasis nestled in the barren landscape. The lush greenery surrounding the pool seemed to mock the desolation he had just trudged through. The fox turned its head briefly, its eyes meeting his once more, before it leapt forward and vanished into the shadows of the surrounding foliage. Enki's legs gave way and he tumbled down the hill toward the oasis, his body rolling over rocks and dry soil. He landed with a splash in the cool, clear water, the shock of it jolting through his senses. For a moment he was submerged, the weight of exhaustion pulling him under. He surfaced with a gasp, his arms flailing as he struggled to find his footing. The water was shallow enough to stand, but his disorientation made it feel like an ocean. As he steadied himself, the sound of his ragged breathing was interrupted by a soft thud. Enki turned toward the shore. There, at the water's edge, sat the fox. Its sleek body still and composed. It had dropped the water skin onto the ground, the strap curling like a snake in the dirt. The fox's amber eyes regarded him with an air of quiet triumph, as though it had known all along how this would end. Enki waded to the edge of the pool, his steps slow and deliberate now. He collapsed onto the ground, his body trembling as he reached for the water skin. It was still full, the precious liquid sloshing inside. He uncapped it and drank deeply, each gulp reviving his parched throat and weary body. When he finally lowered the water skin, his gaze fell on the fox. "You saved me," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. The fox didn't move, its gaze holding his for a moment longer before it turned and disappeared into the trees. Enki watched it go, a strange sense of gratitude and awe washing over him. He looked back at the oasis, its water sparkling in the sunlight. The coolness of it still clung to his skin, a reminder of the life it had given him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Enki allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking to the fox, the water, or the vision of his mother that had brought him this far. "This place," Enki whispered to himself. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Towering trees swayed gently in a breeze that seemed to carry the faint scent of flowers and freshly tilled earth. The air was humid but alive, a sharp contrast to the dry, suffocating winds he had left behind. A distant hum of activity reached his ears, voices, the rustle of movement, and the faint bleating of animals. His voice almost swallowed by the vastness of the scene. "What is this land?" The trees seemed impossibly tall, their roots sprawling like veins into the earth. The ground, once cracked and barren, was now lush and alive. He stepped forward hesitantly, his feet pressing into the soft, damp soil. He couldn't shake the feeling of disorientation, as if he had stepped into a dream that he didn't fully understand. Before he could take another step, a sharp voice cut through the stillness. "Halt!" Enki froze, his heart pounding. Figures emerged from the greenery, their movements swift and deliberate. Bows were drawn, arrows nocked, and spears aimed directly at him. A group of people encircled him, their eyes suspicious and their bodies tense. "Who are you?" one of them demanded, their voice firm and unyielding. "Speak quickly, stranger." I don't mean any harm," Enki stammered, raising his hands in surrender. "I don't even know where I am." "You lie," another voice said, a woman with piercing eyes stepping forward. "You expect us to believe you stumbled upon this place by accident?" "I swear," Enki said, his voice trembling. "I've been traveling for days. I have no weapons, no malice. I'm just trying to survive. Let me see his face," came an older voice from the crowd, steady and commanding. The circle parted, and an elder stepped forward, his robes brushing the ground. His eyes, sharp and penetrating, studied Enki for a long moment. "Lift your head," the elder said, his tone softer but no less authoritative. Enki hesitated, but then he raised his face to meet the elder's gaze. The older man drew in a sharp breath, his expression shifting from suspicion to awe. "Those eyes," the elder murmured. He stepped closer, peering into Enki's face as though searching for something. Then, with a trembling voice, he asked, "Who is your father?" "Taran," Enki replied, his voice barely audible. "My father's name is Taran." A collective murmur swept through the group. The elder's face softened, and his hands lowered. "Taran," the elder repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "He was one of us, many years ago. If you are his son, then there is no doubt." Enki's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? Where am I?" The elder placed a firm but gentle hand on Enki's shoulder and smiled faintly. "You are in the Sunlands." The name struck Enki like a thunderclap. The Sunlands, whispered in legends and impossible dreams. He had thought it was merely a tale his father used to tell, a fantasy of a place that could not truly exist. "He is not our enemy," the elder declared, turning to the crowd. "Lower your weapons. This man carries the blood of one who brought us hope in our darkest times." The hostility in the air began to dissipate, though many still regarded Enki with suspicion. The elder motioned for him to follow. "Come," he said. "There is much to discuss, and you have much to learn." Enki glanced back at the faces of the villagers, their guarded expressions still heavy with doubt.
But as he followed the elder deeper into the Sunlands, a spark of hope flickered within him. He had found the Sunlands, and perhaps in finding them he would find himself.